Good evening, good afternoon, hello, and welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Colby Keough. I'm the Board Secretary and Communications Lead on CAPAL's Board of Directors. I'll be helping facilitate today. For those joining for the first time, CAPAL is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. And the Washington Leadership Program, the WLP, what we're doing here tonight, is one of our signature programs that introduces students to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander leaders in public service who help inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. This year's WLP theme is reflection and resiliency, emphasizing the ability of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through unforeseen times. And what a year it has been for our community. Through today's session and the sessions of the last 6 weeks, panelists and attendees have reflected upon events leading up to 2021. We've emphasized how communities unite to reflect and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances. All of our WLP sessions are recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and are available for later viewing. So if you missed some of our past sessions, we highly encourage you to check them out. Week to week, this year's panelists have been absolutely phenomenal, so please give them a look. Now, I would like to welcome you to our seventh and final session of the 2021 CAPAL WLP series, Our Voice, Our Power, AANHPI Cross-Community Alignment. This session will address where the AANHPI community aligns itself in terms of providing solidarity and building cross-community connections outside the AANHPI realm. Key topics will include AANHPI involvement and perspective of recent social movements and events, the challenges and repercussions of the complexity of the AANHPI community, and how that translates to cross-community alignment and ways in which to move forward and build productive dialogue and bridges. So follow along, join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCAPAL and tag us at CAPALDC. There'll be a short survey, as always, that will pop up after we close the session. Don't worry, I'll remind you about it. We'll greatly appreciate any and all feedback. I'd like to thank our speakers, our panelists this evening for spending their time with us, and to all of you for tuning in. And a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsors for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of an audience activity, a panel discussion, and an audience Q&A. So start those finger stretches and please submit any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box and we will close out afterwards. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our superstar Program and Operations Associate at CAPAL, Hannah, to set the stage for our panel with an audience activity. Over to you, Hannah.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Colby. And then good evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Park. And I am the Programs and Operations Associate at CAPAL. Very big thank you to everybody for joining us for our final Washington Leadership Program session tonight. So before we begin the panel discussion, you can see that we'll be talking about some pretty heavy and deep topics tonight surrounding personal identity and cross-community building and solidarity. So before we dive into the discussion, I would like to open up with a very quick audience activity, which I will launch shortly, and you will see in the chat as well. Okay, so in the chat, you will see a link to a Menti poll that will ask for you to put down the first 3 words or short phrases that come to mind when you think of the term solidarity. And this is really open. These can be names of people, events, places. These can also be feelings, actions, etc. Really just your first instinct and reaction for when you think of the word solidarity and what that encompasses. So as folks are filling out the poll, I will say that I think for a lot of us, as Colby has mentioned before, in the past few months and years, with all of the events that have been going on in our country and in the world, we have experienced so much in a very short amount of time. And so as folks are logging in from across the country and maybe even internationally as well, we are all come from a very diverse set of backgrounds. And with that, we all offer really unique perspectives in terms of how we personally frame the term solidarity and what that means to us. So I will pause here and give everyone a few minutes to fill out the survey. I will also pull up a slide that has the QR code and access code as well for people to see. And yeah, so I will give a few minutes for people to submit their responses. As a quick side note, you can submit multiple responses for the poll, and all responses are anonymous. And in a couple of minutes, I will go ahead and share the results. Okay, so it seems like most people have filled out the poll. If folks still need a little bit more time, feel free to let me know in the chat, but I will go ahead and pull up the results and share them with everybody. Okay, so in 1 second, you will see all of the results from everybody, and 1 second as I pull it up. And if the text is too small, or if anyone has any issues viewing, also let me know as well too. But I think if people are able to see the poll, then we can go ahead and get started. So you can see here that some of the words that people have put down, community was a really big thing. So how this works is that when more people put down various words, and that word gets bigger. So community was one that came up a lot. We also see that strength, understanding, empathy, us, Black Lives Matter, unity, love, supporting Indigenous. Yuri Kochiyama is an example of a person that came to mind for some folks. Addressing anti-Blackness, that is definitely a topic and an issue that definitely comes to mind when thinking of cross-community solidarity, intersectionality, struggle, courage, allyship, visibility, abolition, showing up, collaboration, togetherness, vulnerability, resilience, action, collective, safety, sacrifice, LGBTQ, one about white supremacy, creativity, connection, love, community building. So these are all words, like these are all very visceral first reactions that people have put in, and it's really interesting kind of seeing the trends, but also the different perspectives from everybody in the word cloud as well. So again, these are very interesting, insightful responses from everyone. Big thank you to everybody for participating and also lending your insight for the night. So with all of these responses in mind, I will now hand it over to our facilitator, Colby, to introduce our panelists for the night.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that activity. Really appreciate your candor. We really appreciate you taking the time to, I think, share your reactions. And Hannah, thanks for the creative activity. Also, thank you for all the work you've done to pull this session and all the sessions together. Okay, everybody, let's get rolling. Let's give a warm welcome to Erica Shimizu-Banks, who will be our moderator for this panel, leading both the discussion and the Q&A. A little bit about Erica. She is a tech policy expert and inclusion innovator. She's the founder of SHISO, a consultancy that applies an intersectional equity lens to business development, tech, and policy challenges. She creates systems and frameworks to elevate and restore equity in our institutions, was named a Forbes 30 Under 30 social entrepreneur and a tech titan by Washingtonian magazine. On top of this, she served on President Biden's Innovation Policy Committee, founded and led federal affairs for Pinterest DC office, led diversity and equity initiatives on Google's legal team, serving as the Black Small Business Liaison for the DC area. She co-founded Beacon, the DC Women Founders Initiative, was a political appointee in the Obama administration, and advanced environmental justice policies in the state of Washington. She holds an MSc in environmental policy from Oxford University and a BA in environmental studies and public affairs from Seattle University. To learn more about Erica, visit Erica, that's AERICA.co, erica.co. Erica, thank you so much for taking time to lead us today. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Colby, and it's wonderful to be with CAPAL again. When I worked at Google, I had the amazing opportunity to link y'all to Google's policy team and work with you all on the WLP sessions back then. So it's wonderful to be reunited. I am so honored to be here and happy to join you all. And I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel with such incredible advocates and folks from our community. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves after I say their names. So Dylan Rodriguez is a professor at the University of California at Riverside. Dylan, please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
How's it going? I'm Dylan, he, him pronouns. I live in occupied Kauai, Tonga land, otherwise known as Southern California. I work at University of California, down the street from where Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller shortly before I came on as a faculty member. I just finished my 20th year as a faculty member at UC Riverside. I've been involved in various forms of social movement, radical movement, abolitionist movement for almost my entire adult life. I guess a couple other things. I'm right now actively involved in the Cops Off Campus movement, which seeks as a bare minimum to eliminate police presence on college and university campuses. We're building on the success of K-12 movements to eliminate police there, and a bunch of other stuff. I'm one of the founding members of Critical Resistance, which is a national and somewhat international collective of people fighting for carceral police abolition. And I hope to share more of myself with you tonight. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I really enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Next, we have Chaya Chung, who is the Executive Director of Mekong NYC. And Chaya, please correct me if I pronounced your name incorrectly, but we're looking forward to hearing more about you.
Good evening, everyone. No, you did perfectly. So thank you for that, Chaya, Cham, and I've had so many, so I appreciate you saying it right. I'm calling in or joining you all from the Bronx, New York. I guess y'all can tell from my accent. At my cooking dinner I just finished, so we children are away doing things, and so and that is folks just hooting and hollering in my household. So I organize here in the Bronx and throughout New York City, particularly working with the Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees. I came to as a refugee myself at the age of 7, so some of our work is around health justice, around addressing detention and deportations of Southeast Asian, criminalization, and all the intersection, all the words that folks put out. So I was excited to see all the words that popped up because we know what it is in writing, but in practice. And so I'm hoping that we can talk about that more, what it means to go through solidarity, what it means to resist, and what it means to to engage in fights in our community that is long-term. So I'm excited to be with you all tonight.
Thank you so much, Chaya. Next, we have Skye Wildcat, who is the project coordinator and research consultant at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Skye, please.
Sio Nagata, Skye Wildcat Dakwadon, Galalo Julaktana, Jigadohan, Galie League. Hello, everybody. My name is Skye Wildcat. Galalo is my Cherokee name, and I'm happy to be here with you all today. So I am Cherokee and Muskogee Creek, currently residing in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But I am really excited to be here with everybody and have some good conversation. So wado, thank you.
Thank you so much, Skye. We also have Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is the professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of and the University of Texas Department of History. Dr. Joseph, please tell us more about yourself.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Peniel Joseph, I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. I was on my first picket line over 40 years ago, 1199 SCIU. My mom's a hospital worker, 82 years young. I just saw her for the first time since the pandemic. And, you know, I've been doing this for over 40 years now. So we represent Southside Jamaica, Queens. We represent Brooklyn. We represent the Lower East Side of Manhattan as well. So I'm a native New Yorker. I learned everything that I know from my mother, who's a historian of Haiti, hospital worker, the best person I ever met. And who is a radical political activist, but who really leads with love. So everybody who had to find out about who they were in high school and college, I always feel sorry for them because we knew who we were at our house from the time we were born. And we had these conversations about the Haitian Revolution, about Black feminism, about revolutionary activism ever since I can remember, right? And so I'm very happy to be here tonight. And, you know, it's a long struggle that we're all a part of, and hopefully we can be optimistic about this and not just be performative. I think I grew up in a household where people were on picket lines to get real things. Like, you know, we went from having no dental care to having dental care. So that's what movement and activism is about. It's become something much different because of neoliberalism. We're all caught up in there. We are all capitalists now. They've branded what we do. Can you imagine that? Martin Luther King Jr. did not die a millionaire, neither did Malcolm X, but their legacies have become these billion-dollar legacies. And we have to admit that. We have to admit that as we're struggling to build a new world where billionaires don't just sort of go up in space and then give us their little trinkets on the way down, those of us who are suffering on the earth, right? And you know, 100 million for you, no 100 million for you. It's become tragic and absurd, but we have to have good humor. And I, you know, again, I owe everything to my mother. And I'd love to talk about the generational struggle that we're all locked in and how the elders have really helped us, even as we've been focusing on the youth movement of BLM, but we would be nothing. And I know what Dylan is part of in terms of critical resistance. And I knew folks who were connected to these movements in New York City just growing up. And it's a long struggle, long struggle. And that struggle continues. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much. And last, but certainly not least, Amalia Chamorro, who is the Associate Director of Education at Unidos US. Amalia, please.
Hi, well, that's a tough act to follow, but I will give it my best shot. So I lead education policy for Unidos US, formerly the National Council of La Raza. We went through a name change about 5 years ago, and most people are still familiar with our old name, but I'm originally from Peru and my family immigrated to California. So given some California love, I know there's a lot of New York representation here. So with Dylan, we'll represent California. So I came from the Central Valley, mostly in California, and then finally made my way to DC just 3 years ago after 15 years and local, state, and federal policy, to focus more at the national level. And so my work encompasses early childhood education, K-12, and higher education. And I'm happy to be here with all of you for a very important conversation.
Thank you so much. I love the range of experiences, range of geography. In terms of my contribution there, I'm from Sacramento in California on the West Coast, and I'm usually based in DC, but I am in New York this month. So represent to all of those places. So let's get this started. We have so much to talk about, so much that we share, but also such a diversity of experiences, which I'm excited to get into. The first question, how has COVID affected our communities? We know what we read in the news, we know what we're seeing every day, but I think as leaders, it's especially helpful to hear your experiences and your advice on how we continue effective public health and racial justice work to advance our communities. Amalia, would love to start with you.
Sure, yeah, and I'll take the education sort of impact on what's been happening to students of color with COVID, because obviously we know that our communities of color have been the most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in many ways, right? Not just in terms of infections and death rates, but also in terms of the economic challenges and crises that it has resulted in for our families. And as we know, many of our Latino students, a lot of them who did not even have devices or internet connection at home, definitely struggled at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's continued to be a struggle, right? As schools went from fully remote to then some hybrid, reopening, closing back up, a lot of changes. And what we experienced and heard from our parents, especially parents of English learners, was that it was really challenging to, just communicate with the schools, right? To get the information in their language that they could understand about, how the plans were changing, how their students could be supported, right? And I know that's something too that has been an issue for many immigrant communities and also, communities of color, just in terms of just having that information about schools, about health, in a language and in a culturally responsive way that they can understand and also just better take in. And so, even though we know that many of our Latino students have been challenged, and as we look to the start of the school year, which is fast approaching, right, the new school year, and how schools are actually going to be able to engage students back in person. Hopefully that is the case, because we know that that's the best way that most students learn best. We've also seen some data that's been pretty concerning about Asian students. And the federal government actually has been tracking monthly, which students have been going back in person, who's still remaining remote. And for me, it was pretty striking to see that actually the highest rate of students who are still in remote learning are Asian students. And it's really important, I think, to unpack like why that is, right? And there's obviously very many reasons, but a couple of them that really stood out as we were trying to also just understand that, right, was, just the fear and the trauma that the Asian community has experienced with all of the incidents and the racism and discrimination that's been thrown at the community with respect to Asian hate, right? And that really exacerbated by the pandemic, right? And so that's something that, we as the Latino community, want to support the Asian community on, right? Because sometimes, they come for us, sometimes they come for you. We need to join forces and really stand up for one another if we're going to really unbuckle and really bring down the racism that exists and continues to perpetuate in our country. So I'll just start there, just in terms of just sharing about how some of the ways that the Latino community has been impacted, but also recognizing the many ways that the Asian community has also been challenged.
Thank you so much, Amalia. I think that is one of the key visibilities of the pandemic is the disparate outcomes and disparate impacts. And as we see folks coming back to work and to school, as we're also seeing in schools, as you mentioned, a recent report from Project Include showed that Asian American women were receiving increasing discrimination, not just in person, but also now remotely and through social media. And so for as many folks who are not comfortable sending their kids back to school, so many people are not comfortable coming back to offices where there are toxic, racist, and sexist environments. Skye, I would love to get your perspective on this question as well, especially with respect to the varying rates of infection and death amongst communities.
Yeah. And so I was looking up a recent analysis, well, I guess recent as of April, so I'm sure it's much worse now, but American Indians or Alaska Natives were 3.5 times higher compared to white Americans during the first 7 months of pandemic to get COVID. But in contrast to that, our tribal nations all over the states have probably the highest vaccination rates and probably the most effective clinics in administering vaccinations. For example, Cherokee Nation, where I'm from in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, we were able to open our phases up to non-tribal citizens, or open the vaccination to non-tribal citizens much faster than the state of Oklahoma was. So we had completed all of our phases, before Oklahoma even got to the point of, one of our first tiers. And luckily our first tier did consist of having our elders and our first language speakers, people who are teaching our cultures, teaching our crafts, those things that are lost with every single elder that we've lost to this pandemic, and every single person that we've lost this pandemic just means that it gets scarier and scarier. How much longer do we have of this pandemic and of this fear of that we are going to lose our language or our culture, because the ones that are keeping it are, at risk. And so, for example, my grandma is in the hospital right now. She's not there for COVID, she's there for a stroke, but she's had to spend her nights in the hallway because all of the beds are taken. And most of the beds that are taken are by people who aren't vaccinated in Oklahoma. And that's another part that's kind of a paradox, because we want our elders and our tribe and all of our members to get vaccinated because we care about each other. But it's hard to tell them to trust a government entity or even a healthcare entity, when they faced all these, everything bad that you can think of, is probably something that they've experienced in their lifetime. So we have, kind of two ends of the spectrum here, but I'm definitely glad to hear more about everybody else's experiences too.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Skye, and our strongest wishes for a swift recovery and healthy recovery to your grandmother. And I hope she's able to stay safe in the hospital. I wanted to read a quote really briefly from an Alabama doctor on treating the unvaccinated, where, as we now know, folks who are hospitalized for COVID who are not vaccinated are 99% of COVID deaths at this point. Versus folks who are vaccinated. And she said, they cry, they tell me they didn't know, they thought it was a hoax, they thought it was political. They thought because they had a certain blood type or a certain skin color, and I think we all know what that skin color is, white, they wouldn't get sick. They thought it was just the flu, but they were wrong. So a lot to face here, and still educating, but also I think addressing the entitlement, right, of a people, a country that, and groups within this country that had access to the vaccine earlier but refused to take it, and the ramifications of that. Chaya, I would love to ask for your perspective as well on this question on how COVID has affected your communities, especially because of what we know about the lack of data disaggregation in the Asian community, and how East Asian narratives and needs are sometimes, and incomes especially, are sometimes overrepresented when we talk about the Asian community. And as you work on behalf of the South Asian community, Southeast Asian community, that is so often neglected in these spaces, what has the impact of COVID been? And has there been, what has that been like in terms of cultural and linguistic outreach and hospital treatment and related areas, if you know?
Yeah. Thank you, Amalia and Skye, for sharing. I think that, this just brings me a lot of just talking about like all the deaths, and I don't, folks in New York, you all remember like 24 hours sirens. I mean, I don't, and I get this thing in our community as well, anxiety around like this can happen again if folks don't get vaccinated. So I think particularly for the Southeast Asian community, a lot of things like triggered. We have one of the highest rate of PTSD because of the trauma that people experienced from war 30 years ago. And here we are, Mekong has been fighting for culturally sensitive mental health program continuing, right? Because we believe that healing is a lifelong process. And here it is, institutions saying, oh, you've been here for 30 years. Why are you still suffering? Because it's intergenerational, because it takes many generations. And I learned that also from the Native folks. So, and so being resettled in the Bronx, if you can imagine the 1980s, our community was pretty much inserted into urban poverty. And so our work has always been anti-Asian violence work, right? Like making sure our communities have homes, our elders get fed, our young people go to school. And yeah, like we say in Mekong, like we're like the myth and the model minority myth. Like we have the lowest attainment in education, highest in poverty, living in highest rate of safety net programs, all that stuff. And I think that, we've had to really pivot our work into doing mutual aids. And then like our staff didn't stop working during pandemic. Like, we were essential in so many ways. And so having to always fight the city, the state to say like, give us some resources. We're the people who the community trusts. And so oftentimes what we found out, I mean, we haven't really thought about how we're gonna tell the stories yet, but we've collected so many stories of community members saying, making decisions for themselves, saying like, oh, I'm not gonna go to the hospital because I know I'm gonna die because I'm not gonna have a translator. So people died at home, right? And like the numbers are not gonna get tracked. And so making these decisions because they know that that they have control over those decisions. But if they go to the hospital, they don't. And so finding out people having to make those choices, and then we have to translate every single thing that the city was putting out every time, and like having to do hotlines and all that. I mean, my staff like worked hours and then doing care packages, giving them lemongrass and all the healing herbs that our community use. And so because they were like, we don't want like block of cheese, like what are we gonna do with a block of cheese? And so so I think we went deeply into like holding our people arts and culture center, but also like advocating, even like building the People of Color Health Initiative around centering it around racial justice, because we no longer was like, we work on the same issue. No, we actually understand how like anti-Blackness and the way in which white supremacy work and makes us as a wedge in all of this. And so there was been a lot of shift, and we had an uprising during this whole time, right? And we had a Hmong cop who stood by to see George Floyd being killed. And so like our community, like, I don't know, there's like all this gender stuff and intersectionality stuff that comes up around, like we were like fighting, and our men were just like, oh, we're gonna kill you, all this stuff. And like, because you're standing for Black lives. And then when the when the shooting happened in Atlanta, like they were silent, our men were silent. I said, this is why this is a gender justice issue. This is why our work have to have all those intersectionality and those thinking around like what it means to be queer, what it means to be, a woman in this work, because like you're fighting patriarchy and capitalism all at the same time. Like it's exhausting, right? So I think that what it did for our community was like trigger all the trauma that people experience, the sense of isolation of like losing family members. Myself, I had at one time 18 family members got caught COVID because they were all hospital workers. And so for us, like we had a down meeting around like, and we live in a multi-generational household. And so myself and my husband, my daughter were the only, so we had to go to different household to feed everybody, to make sure, I mean, you can imagine the anxiety. And I'm just like, I hope they stay alive because they've survived the Khmer Rouge. Like I don't want them to die this way. And so just the lack of resources from government, from people, from institutions that's supposed to, but we always know that these institutions always fails us. And so it was like another failure and another way that our community and our people come through for each other. And so as much as it was hurtful, harmful, there's been so much love and so much like reminder of how resilient our people are, but a reminder of all these people that also fails us, continue to do so. Our men, the government, our allies, white people. So anyway, so that's sort of the circle that we were in, the chaos. And I don't think this is not over. And I want, we are thinking about like, what does it mean for like after the pandemic? Like, I think the effect of it will continue. And I know that we'll talk more about that, what it can look like, we're all scared, but we're also, folks also want to be vaccinated. We got people vaccinated. That's the other thing. You're right, Skye. Like we got so many people vaccinated. I mean, it meant going to the sites, calling for everybody and having it sign up for entire family. Like that was the work that got everyone vaccinated, and people don't understand that. And so really big up to all the folks that been hitting the ground, still hitting the ground today.
Thank you so much, Chaya. You brought so many threads, you raised so many issues and brought so many threads together that we will continue weaving through this conversation. And I think one, I want to call out and give a moment of appreciation for all of the essential workers, majority of whom are Black and Brown, minorities within our own minority communities as well, who, for them, the pandemic was not a time to stay indoors. It was a time where they had to put their lives at risk, and they have not been rewarded appropriately. So I think the least we can do is acknowledge them in moments like this. So thank you for raising that. And building off of what you said, this is a perfect segue to the next question. In light of the resurgence of movements of Black Lives Matter and Stop AAPI Hate, because again, to your point, Chaya, that has been a fight and continues to be and has been for over 100 years. And the same with Black Lives Matter, we put a label on it, but that is in some ways one of the original fights next to the genocide of Native Americans in this country. We have those original sins of genocide and slavery and marginalization of all people who should be welcome to this country to deal with. And so in light of the resurgence of these movements, how have you all personally reacted? How do we bridge our own experiences in America with the experiences of others? I would love to start with Dylan.
I'm just taking in what Chaya, Skye, and Amalia were saying, and I'm gonna hopefully think about my response as being in continuity with what the three of my comrades here just said, because the way I think we have to understand this convergence of the pandemic and this massive global movement against genocidal anti-Black violence, which is what it is. We got to stop calling it BLM because BLM has become a brand. We should all be educating ourselves on the kind of internal critical analysis of what's happened with Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation. Maybe that's another conversation we could have at a different time. But we need to understand it as a massive global movement against anti-Black state violence, particularly police violence. And what that convergence of pandemic and this movement has done is it's brought attention to what can only be called the normalized conditions of asymmetrical warfare that structure the United States of America. That's what the United States of America is. It is what the Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration are all complicit in. Apologies to Erica, because I know that you were appointed by a couple of those administrations.
No need to apologize.
You know what I mean? But this is what the United States is. It is engaged in varieties of asymmetrical, one-directional warfare. The movements of 2020, the movements that crested at a global scale in 2020 were movements to stop the casualties of that asymmetrical war. It was centering on the logics of anti-Black genocide that structured the United States. The pandemic, as my colleagues here have stated, is replicating the logics of colonialism and genocide, targeting variety communities, particularly Native communities in the United States, and for that matter, elsewhere. And what I think I'd want to emphasize, well, first of all, as a friendly kind of revision of the question, I don't think it matters how I personally reacted to any of this shit. Right? I don't think y'all should really care about that. I think what we should care about is some sense of a collective response and how we might cultivate a collective response. I'm not dismissing the personal. The personal is very important. Like that's how we, relate to each other. But when we're talking about a moment, historical moment, like the one we're inhabiting right now, the collective, the collective, the creation of the collective, the creation of different forms of moving, critical, liberation-oriented community, that's really, to me, all that fucking matters. That's all that matters. So I think we're in a moment right now where with the Biden administration and the remnants of the Trump populist movement still being quite resurgent, we're in a moment of reaction against the movements of liberation and self-defense, what you might call a combination of both state repression and popular counterinsurgency. This is the period that we're in. I think how we frame this moment is really important. That we frame it as a moment of both massive liberation movement and massive counterinsurgency. I think the thing that's really critical, I'm referring to what my colleague Professor Joseph just referred to, the $100 million the big performance $100 million grant that Bezos put out, and the longtime enemy of social movements, Van Jones, accepted recently. Van Jones is garbage. Don't ever trust him. I've been in movements with him. I can go all day. I'll go in on Van all day, every day, y'all. He is not to be trusted. So the fact that he was given this grant is actually ominous. It is not something to be celebrated. It is part of the counterinsurgency, and I think what we need to understand as well is that the period that we're in now is one in which the front line of counterinsurgency is actually reform. That reformist approaches are kind of displacing transformative, radical, liberation-oriented, abolitionist-oriented approaches to policing, incarceration, criminalization, colonialism, anti-Black violence, et cetera. And in fact, I'll stop in a second, that reformist counterinsurgency is in many ways emblematized by the severe limitations of the Stop AAPI hate movement, right? Now, I want to give props to all my colleagues, comrades in the movement that were not limited by the Stop AAPI hate kind of hashtag line, and were actually deeply engaged in solidarity building struggles within and across different communities, within and beyond so-called AAPI communities. So I'm talking about a certain kind of mainstreaming of Stop AAPI hate that, number one, depended on policing. We have to be really clear about that what Stop AAPI hate did was it actually elevated the role of policing, and it created this kind of symbiosis between a projected AAPI community interest and vigorous policing, really implicitly in many cases of Black people and Black communities, right? Part of this was buying into this kind of right wing and then leaking into the mainstream narrative of Black on Asian violence, which just 5 minutes of Google searching would show you was absolute right wing propaganda, right? The overwhelming majority of violence against Asian and Asian descended people in the United States during that spike was committed by white people, right? We have to be very, very clear about that, despite these spectacles of individual Black on Asian violence. There's also the dependence on hate crime legislation, which we should have learned that lesson 20 years ago, right? That hate crime legislation has never served the people who we think about as being the primary kind of vulnerable communities and bodies to what we call hate crime. So the dependence really on the FBI, imagine that, right? That you're depending on the FBI and its categorization of hate crimes to defend you and your community against racist attack. It's not sane. And then finally, I think we need a better collective analysis, a shared collective analysis that understands the full scope of white nationalist movement that's increasingly multicultural in its composition. Barack Obama was part of that. In some ways, he was the front lines of that. We need a more serious analysis of violence and how violence works. We need more robust projects of solidarity across communities and within communities, for that matter, that struggle to stop repressive violence. I can go on and on. If y'all will humor me, I'll put a couple short pieces of writing that I kind of obsessed over the last year on the topics that I just referred to here, in the hopes that if y'all find it useful, you can read them or just use them somewhere, whatever. But it's just part of my contribution to the conversations. I want to stop talking now and let other folks have the mic. Thank you again for asking me the question. It's a really important question.
Thank you so much, Dylan. It absolutely is. And I would love those resources as you've just dropped a dissertation on us all in these last few minutes. A lot to discuss and digest in that. And I really appreciate you raising the issues around this Stop API hate movement. As I've often said when I'm asked about this movement and questions about it, I say, you know, at the root of it, at the end of the day, we need to end white supremacy. That's the real battle. We can divide, but that's how they conquer. And let's destruct that. So thank you for that. And I would like to go to Dr. Joseph next on this question as well. So Dr. Joseph, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Erica. You know, I think that one, in terms of even connecting it to the last question, I think one that we're in a period of reconstruction in America and globally, right? And I'm actually working on a new book on this, this idea of America's third reconstruction and what does that mean? And in a lot of ways, you know, the personal really matters. So I actually would say that, you know, how we feel as human beings, for those of us who are pushing for human rights, and the end of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, but just colonialism and sort of, you know, settler colonialism, and anti-indigeneity and anti-LGBTQ, it really actually matters. So I think when we think about this idea of reconstruction, well, we have to think about it. We got to scale this stuff down. I mean, Malcolm X taught us to make it plain. So we have to speak in a language to people that says, look, what we're seeing right here are echoes of earlier periods in America, in American and global history of backlash, of white supremacy, of absolutely state-sanctioned violence. But there's also been opportunities amidst this crisis. So when we think about how did this pandemic impact people of color and Black folks, it impacted them disproportionately negatively, and we have the data for that. Yet at the same time, and this really is one of the opportunities, but then there's dangers of neoliberalism. One of the opportunities is the fact that 15 to 26 million people came out in the streets for not just Black lives, certainly for Black lives, but for human rights for all people in a way where they understood the message. And this message of intersectionality is a message that certainly is part of a Black feminist tradition, but it's also part of other people's traditions as well. So there are different feminist and Black radical people of radical traditions that have talked about intersectionality, that have been resistant to patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia for a long durée. So one thing, this is not new, you know, and some of this gets caught up in the anti-critical race theory. But when we think about this period of reconstruction, then what are the opportunities? The opportunities for us are immense. And the opportunities are not the $100 million grant, right? Although I do agree that certainly the term Black Lives Matter has been branded in a way, but I still don't think we should somehow not use that term, right? Use that phrase. Black power, which I study, became commodified as well. But just because Richard Nixon said his vision of Black power is Black capitalism, I still use the term Black power. When I talk about Black power, I'm talking about it in the context of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, Gwen Patton, Fran Beal, right? So it's a different vision, Assata Shakur, of Black, what does Black power mean, right? So it's anti-imperialist, it's anti-capitalist, it's pro-human rights in a very specific way, right? And so when we think about this period of reconstruction, the opportunities have been really, really immense. One, we have to think about the fact that even though somebody might list this under reform, the very fact that it's Black folks and people of color who got Joe Biden elected to have a pandemic bill that actually has relieved the pain empirically of people of color, of communities of color, is not a small thing, right? We have to strategize for transformative public policy that goes beyond the pandemic bill, that gives us redistributive justice, that gives us reparations, both for Black communities, but for other communities, of course. But we have to take real understanding of the opportunities that we have, right? So when James Baldwin tells us that we can achieve a different country and a different nation, in a lot of ways, Lorraine Hansberry and other people have said the same thing. We've got to take that to heart, right? So as somebody who's been around movements and in movements for decades, and not movements where people are performing, and I love the fact that I found out about movements through my Haitian mother, who was a hospital worker with 2 boys, who was on picket lines, and this stuff mattered. It wasn't theoretical. So she wasn't reading stuff, right, from an ebony or ivory tower. It mattered for us to keep the lights on, to have electricity, all right? It mattered, right? So we were in neighborhoods where people were getting mugged and there was gang violence. All Black neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods. We did not grow up in the suburbs, right? So all of this mattered. So if you understand how politics actually work and how social movements work, and if you've been within social movements that succeed and fail, right? You have to look at this period as a period where we have an unbelievable opportunity, right? It's not just about, I'm saying, okay, you've got Amazon and $100 million and people trying to take over this period. Absolutely. You've got backlash and anti-critical race theory. Absolutely. But what does it mean to have a Black Trans Lives Matter march in June of 2020 with 15,000 people, not just all queer people, and that the radical democracy of that moment, right? Where in previous generations, even during the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement and the first, those groups of people would have been marginalized. What does it mean for the policy agenda when we think about 2016, the original Black Lives Matter policy agenda that talks about reparations, that talks about immigration beyond just Spanish-speaking immigration. It talks about Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders. It talks about Haitians. We are always left out of the conversation. You know, Haiti is always left out of the conversation. And Haiti provides a context for America's liberation of Black and other indigenous people. None of y'all would be free without 1804. None of y'all. You've got to know that. You've got to understand that. 1791 to 1804 is the game changer. The first independent. We go from a colony of enslaved Africans into a republic of citizens, and we bled and died for that. That's what we've given to the whole world. And we are paying in terms of neo-colonialism, terror, and violence ever since. The first country that was embargoed against was not Cuba, it was Haiti by Thomas Jefferson. People don't understand that, right? So Haiti flows through the blood of the veins of the entire world. Unless Haiti is free, none of us are ever gonna be free. So we have to say this is a period of reconstruction. To how do we reconstruct not just American democracy, but Western and global society? How do we do that, right? And when we think about this idea of violence, this structural violence is also connected to narratives. This anti-critical race theory is connected to voter suppression. And when we think about Asian American Pacific Islanders, to bring it all back, what they have told Asian American and Pacific Islander and even Native and Indigenous communities is that whatever your oppression is, at least you are not Black. Blackness, right, is the organizing principle, anti-Blackness of the entire caste system. Isabel Wilkerson talks about caste, and caste is a part. I love that book, but she turns it into a big superstructure. It's really part of something that's even more complicated when you think about caste, because anti-Blackness is really not just about, it's not just about the class stratification, and class and race are obviously connected, but it's anti-Blackness is the organizing principle. And when Toni Morrison says the first word that immigrants learn is you know, the racial slur, the N-word, she's not kidding. So they've divided us, and this, you know, I agree with what Dylan was saying exactly. The right wing set it up where it was Black men who were terrorizing Asian AAPI communities. When all the data shows us it's white men who are doing this. It's white folks who are violently attacking. They do that just like the anti-critical race theory is really a connection, a continuation of the lost cause mythology that is all about the Klan and the Confederacy, right? Lost Cause is what gives us not just Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal workforce because of Lost Cause. Lost Cause is 1915. We still have Stone Mountain, Georgia, the resurgence of the Klan. We've got them etched in Stone Mountain, Georgia. That's what King was talking about August 28, 1963, right? In 1924, 40,000 Klansmen march on Washington, D.C. in 1925 in August. So we are at a pivotal moment, but we have to think about the massive opportunities that we have to push not only just the Biden administration, but at the state and the local level, but also the global, to say, how can we reconfigure and reimagine American democracy, a democracy that creates the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. By the end of his life, and I'll close here, Dr. King was a man on fire, influenced and inspired by Malcolm X. And yes, Malcolm X, even though they try to set those folks up as two polar opposites. And Dr. King was saying that white folks were inherently racist. It's Dr. King who said the halls of Congress are running wild with racism. It's Dr. King who said that the reason we had to have a Poor People's March is because Reconstruction had failed because of white supremacy, and they gave millions of acres of land that Black people should have had and Black people worked for through the Homestead Act to white immigrants, right? And then they're telling Black people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So if we want a beloved community, we have to think of how can we reconstruct this violence, and certainly policy-wise, because we're all interested in policy, we have to think about, we have to say we are for reparations. We are absolutely for the abolishment of prisons. We're absolutely for the reimagining of public safety and reinvesting monies that are going to punishment now and police in Black communities. We want sex workers released from all federal and state and local prisons immediately. We want everybody who has mental illness who's in prison released immediately and to be given care. We want a guaranteed income for every single American, right? And we also want local repair and redistributive justice where, for instance, I live in Austin, Black people were kicked out of Clarksville and Wheatsville, a freedom town that they created in the 1870s. These are all white communities now. And we actually want redistributive justice for Black local Austinites, and we can find them. They've been kicked out to Pflugerville. They've been kicked out to Cedar Park. We can find them, and we actually need to bring those people back. We actually need to bring those people back, give them housing, yes, free housing, and equity in that housing to produce wealth. So we have a huge opportunity in front of us. And certainly we have to focus on the challenges, but I don't want us to lose sight of the massive opportunities. Think about AAPI and convergence. We have to understand that anti-Blackness organizes the oppression that we all face, right? So if we want to get in on this, yes, you do have to say Black Lives Matter, even if you're not connecting it to some brandification, just like Black Power. We still do want Black Power. The only way we're going to get citizenship and equality for all people is by getting it for Black people. That's the only way, because Blackness is the lowest. Remember Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, his 1992 bestseller was Faces at the Bottom of the Well. That's what we have always been. We are the organizing principle for it globally. And unless we save those folks, we're not going to save anybody.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Another incredible thesis statement that unites both what Dylan mentioned and what others on the panel have talked about and gave us that important historical context. What I often say is it's a yes and, right? And this is a perfect segue into the next question, because in order to, help chart this true multicultural progressive future, we must know where we've come from. And we must know the history and the context behind movements, behind language, behind narratives, to build a more just future, a just future that is rooted in truth. And so we have to be honest about the roots of oppression, about how they manifest today, and the ways in which they're both concealed and also in which they're compromised and co-opted. I think about one piece of history that many folks don't know, but should, is that, the roots of American racism are actually rooted in the Iberian Portuguese first pursuit of colonialism back in the 15th century. And that initial link of Blackness to evil, Blackness to penury, Blackness to slavery started there. And the religious justification was given to then launch this global campaign of colonialism that has affected all of our countries and ethnicities of origin. So thank you for that. To your point, the next question, I think I'm going to combine the two, and I would love for everyone to weigh in on this. What is the history of cross-cultural, cross-community alignment and solidarity? And where do we go from here? And in that, what is one thing that your communities are doing, what your organizations are doing to build that future? Who would like to start?
I'll get us started.
Thank you, Amalia.
Sure. And I look forward to hearing from others as well. But I think one thing that I definitely want to lift up right from the conversation so far too is that we cannot function in silos, right? And that we actually make more progress when we work together, right? And in partnership. And we really got to get out of this mindset, right? That a gain for one community is not at the expense of another. That's something that, sometimes I hear, more times than I would like, right? And engaging in those conversations, just making sure that that we really get out of that mind frame and mindset, because that's only going to divide us and keep us apart. And we've seen examples, right? Historical examples of what we can achieve when we actually link up. So I mentioned that I'm from the Central Valley in California, right? And this isn't actually something that, we learned about in school. It's something that I didn't learn until I was actually in college when, we were able to take, classes, ethnic studies, and learn more about the true history. And an example of that is, the farm worker movement, right? It was really started by Filipino farm workers down in Coachella, right? Before everybody knew Coachella as, like the go-to for the outdoor festival and concerts, right? It was farm worker community. And it was Filipino farm workers who went on strike to advocate for better wages and working and living conditions. And it was that drive, that hard work to decide to go on strike that spearheaded this whole movement for agricultural workers in California. They actually won, and from there they went on to Delano, right? Where they try to work with the Mexican farm workers to join forces and go on strike. And that was a challenge because the growers did a really good job of trying to divide the two. And it took a lot of conversations and hard work and, trying to convince Cesar Chavez to go on strike together. And finally, thousands of workers ended up marching to Sacramento. But it was that kind of cross-community solidarity and joining of forces that actually resulted in a farm worker movement that made real change for so many of agricultural workers in California. So that's just one example. And also I think it points to, what can happen when forces try to divide us, right? They can be pretty successful sometimes and they do a pretty good job, and that still happens too often. But another example I like to cite too, just because I'm in the education field, and I work a lot. So I'm an English learner myself, right? I came to the US without knowing English, but I was lucky enough that California at the time had pretty formidable bilingual education, which then was totally dismantled under the governorship of Pete Wilson, right? That really disseminated bilingual education for over 2 decades in California. It wasn't until recently that it was really brought back in the way that it should have been. But I was lucky that when I immigrated to the US, I was able to have English as a second language and have that language instruction where I wasn't lost and having no clue as to what my teacher was saying. But it was actually in 71, it was a Chinese families and students who sued the San Francisco Unified School District, whose students were not getting language instruction and were just sitting there in the class with English only and having no idea what was going on, and students, of course, not progressing. But they sued the school district, and this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until 3 years later that the Supreme Court actually found that the Civil Rights Act protects children, requires schools to provide that language instruction, and found that the school district was in complete violation and discriminating against these students with limited English proficiency. And that inspired other cases and other families. For example, I know we have some New York representation here, but Aspida, right, was a famous case in New York where we had Puerto Rican families suing the New York school district again, standing up for the rights of students with limited English proficiency. And that really spearheaded a whole movement and force to bring bilingual education to the front. And we continue to fight those battles, by the way. We've been trying to repeal this law in Arizona for over 2 decades that restricts bilingual education. And we still have too many Latino students and other students who have limited English proficiency sitting in classrooms for 4 hours a day, not knowing what's going on. So I just paint those couple of examples just to share what can happen and what progress we can make when we inspire one another, when we join forces, and when we stop getting out of our silos, right? And so I just invite my other panelists to join the conversation. I'd love to hear what they have to share.
Thank you so much, Amalia. Thank you for that important reminder. And I think what you raised is tied not only into the faux controversy about critical race theory and how that is being used to oppress and deny the history of this country, but also in the appeals against affirmative action that we see continuously. And it's usually, white right-wing groups co-opting and pretending to represent Asian American groups, sadly, especially in this latest wave of the attack on affirmative action. So thank you for raising that. I would like to go to Chaya next to talk about this question. Tell us about your engagement with the history of cross-cultural movement making and how that informs what you see for the future.
I mean, I think for me, it's I'm alive today because of the civil rights movement and Bayard Rustin, who fought for us to be resettled, right? So my community, my people are alive and really owe it to the organizing and the work of the civil rights activists and organizers at that time. And so, for us, like, Black liberation is in that way. Like, we constantly are doing PE around what it means. And yes, to what said earlier around like Haiti, like we're talking about Haiti, we're organizing with Haiti around deportation of people to Cambodia, to Haiti, and understanding why, even the numbers of people in detentions, Black folks are incarcerated longer, in detention longer, like making those connections. And I think it's constantly like for us to remember and remind ourselves like who actually saved us, and and like who's been leading and who's been fighting. And then also the history is important, and we are living it every single day. And I think about what it means to remind my people of what we gained when we were resettled here. Yeah, we lived in the Bronx and like burning buildings without hot water and all that stuff, but so were all the other Black folks and brown folks that were left here, and so we've entered a relationship into the US that was actually, in the refugee camps, they made us watch cops, and who did you see people getting arrested? Well, Black people. And I remember like my parents telling me this, and this is something that my community have to unlearn, because it's like we were taught anti-Blackness, right? Like when we were, the people in the front line were Black and brown people. And when we were in the refugee camps, there were white people saving us, these white blonde girls coming at the United Nations and white people. And then we were resettled in the hood, in the Bronx and all across the country. And what you saw were Black people robbing us and all that stuff. And, so I think that, you know, we always have to struggle with our people around, are you closest to whiteness? Are you closest to blacks? All that stuff that I think that like is so important in like building organizers and not just activists, right? So like that's to kind of point also, like, you know, we do direct services, but that's because we need to survive in order to thrive. So we thrive by building campaigns, waging campaign that addresses anti-Blackness, that you are absolutely right. Until Black folks are free, we are not free. And so, and I know what it means for like the fight for my lives and our life, right, of my people. And so when I think about solidarity, I think about like, if I'm fighting for my liberation, my people's liberation, like my fight, my life depends on it, solidarity has to look like that for other communities as well. And so there are so many things to remember. There's so many things to deepen, and to remind my people, you know, how we got here and what the fight is gonna look like. And the fight is long. I mean, some of us been this work for like, well, how many years? I have gray hairs now. You know, I have a 21-year-old, and I'm like, this is our life. Like if we don't fight, we will die, you know, and other people will die. And I think that in this moment during the pandemic, like we've had to really struggle with our people, like, who are you really mad at? Like, you know, and like, who's really calling the police? Because we don't call the police, you know, like, we know the criminal justice system only puts our people into immigration detention centers and to be deported. And so, you know, so always reminding ourselves, and I think a lot about like people who are just coming into this movement, who joined because of the uprising and of all the things that have been happening. And I want to remind like our young people really to like organize your people, like go where they're at, you know, like I think about like young organizers who go to organize with other people. And I'm like, yeah, our people may be triggering. Like there's things that are culturally triggering and things that we need to address, and like it may be painful, but you telling me that working for a white organization is more painful than more toxic than working with our people. You know what I mean? So like reminding people, like, let's not be activists, let's organize our people. So go to where your people are at. And so that's like one of the biggest lessons I learned from the Black Civil Rights Movement. And that we, you know, we've learned a lot from Black feminist thinkers, intersectionality. I think we don't talk about that, you know, and remind ourselves like these terms, even the way I talk, you know, there's so many things to learn and unlearn, but I'm so hopeful because of the kind of energy that people have to like, yeah, I actually don't want to be performative. Like I want to be like an organizer. Like I want to fight in a way that loves our people deeply, that like will show pain, our own pain will show up, you know, and like that we are like, as we're surviving that, like people are surviving us. And so all these things, different levels, but stick with it. You know, stay in the movement, stay in the work. I don't know why I went there, but it was just reminding me of like, you know, like people leave and sometimes they will come back. And so we hope that people come back and stay with your people.
Thank you so much, Chaya. I think that I appreciate the beautiful honesty and vulnerability of your remarks, and that incredible reminder that there will always be a home for folks to come back to in this fight for justice. I think of the words of John Lewis, that this is a battle not just of our lifetime, but of lifetimes, to paraphrase. And I also think about, you know, so many folks who have said this in so many different ways, but that when we work to serve the least of us and those who have been marginalized the most, we end up benefiting us all. And I think that's central to remember. I would like to actually, given time, I'd like to end this question with Skye, and then turn to the audience questions, where I think we would really appreciate Peniel and Dylan weighing in. So Skye, if you wouldn't mind closing us out on this question, your reflections of history in solidarity movement and what that looks like for the future for you.
What you said, Chaya, kind of really resonated with me because I'm only 26 and it feels like it's just, there's a lot of pressure, you know, to be a young organizer and try to figure everything out and to be with your people and, you know, just to really put all the pieces together. And so in that, just like reflecting on how other communities have really helped Indigenous people with, you know, the fight at Alcatraz, or like the Dakota Access Pipeline, Even down at the border, I still think it's a fight for it's indigenous people. It's, this is indigenous land. And so we should have a say if you're going to put kids and families in encampments, obviously not like, so I think the biggest thing that I find with solidarity for indigenous people is not reparations, but restoration. Restoring that the idea of land back doesn't necessarily mean, okay, you're not going to have a house anymore, you're not going to have this place to live, but it means we know how to take care of this biodiversity. We know how to uphold, structures of leadership in a way that aren't oppressive or, is not inclusive. We know how to take care of our land. We know how to take care of our communities. We know how to take care of our people. And so in that, it's just trying to find a way for all of us to have sort of that same goal. For us, land back means that we want to give reparations to Black folks who, for example, were brought with us on the trail as slaves, who probably built our homes, who especially, I have that in my own family. And so that's something that I think about all the time, is that I have reparations to give myself. And so I know that there's probably not other Indigenous listeners on the call, but that's something to definitely consider, is the anti-Blackness in our own communities is very, very bad and divisive. And something that I've really been thinking on lately is I'm sure whether or not you've seen it on the news, but just, I don't want to call them residential schools because they're not. They're death camps where our children were sent and, stripped of everything, stripped of their identity, stripped of their language, stripped of their culture. And so with all that coming up recently, it's like, I know that we all represent these big, powerful institutions, whether or not you're at a school or whatever it is. But more than likely that there is a lot of ground to dig up in your own communities. And most of the time, you're not going to have Indigenous person at whatever table you're sitting at. And so I think that's the thing that my community and myself would ask for the most, is just for you to speak up for Indigenous people when there's not a person there. Obviously, we have, some of the lowest rates of representation in any avenue or any profession or, whatever you're doing. And so we need that that acknowledgement, and just to be remembered, to be recalled, and just knowing that we're a big, I think we can be really influential if we had a spot and if we had a voice. And of course we do have Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior now, but kind of as Dr. Joseph was saying earlier, to me, it's still a representation I think that's wrong with this country. So, yeah, I really appreciate listening to everybody. I think it's, you're in the spots that I hope to be in one day. And so, yeah, well, thank you.
Well, Skye, I'd say you're already there, and we are honored to have your voice at this virtual table. And I know, speaking for myself, but I'm sure for many others, we will be reaching out to make sure that Indigenous voices are represented, and you are an amazing resource already. So thank you for offering that. We'd like to do more than speak for people. I think we'd rather have folks speak for themselves and make sure whenever there are opportunities that that's what happens instead. So thank you so much, Skye, for closing out the set questions we have. But a very important question from the audience, building on what Dylan and Peniel started. Could you break down what it means for justice to be redistributive, and also how neoliberal economic structures allow for or encourage the commercialization of movements? Dr. Joseph, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Yeah, so in terms of redistributive justice, I'm just giving 10 points that have been in the policy agenda of a movement for Black lives. It's beyond these 10 points, but reparations. And when we say reparations, it's reparations broadly. Reparations absolutely for Black people who are descendant of enslaved peoples who built this country, but also reparations for people who are from the Caribbean, who are from West Africa, who've been discriminated against historically by structures and also been victims of state-sanctioned violence through the course of United States history, right? But then also reparations for Indigenous people and Native and Indigenous people and AAPI folks who've been discriminated against in Latinx. So there's a lot of, when we think about reparations, it's broadly, I'm absolutely for reparations for slavery and reparations for Black folks and people of color who didn't get access to the GI Bill, even though they fought in the Second World War. Reparations for Black people and people of color who didn't get access to the New Deal because of two-tiered liberalism, white supremacist liberalism, and not getting FHA 30-year low interest mortgages that provided the basis for middle-class wealth in the United States. No bail system, period. Release all prostitutes from jail, really sex workers, so not calling them prostitutes. No death penalty, free education for all people, free healthcare for all people. Defund the police tells a story about reinvesting and reimagining a different world where our money and municipal budgets are not for cops that are killing Black people, that are raping Black women, that are raping people of color, that are denigrating and dehumanizing Black folks and people of color. Reducing the military budget and the global military footprint across the United States, across the world. Redistribution of wealth through tax policy and actually a wealth tax on all wealthy people and wealthy corporations. Publicly financed campaigns, but there's so much more in terms of voting rights and guaranteeing voting for every single person in the United States, letting people who are incarcerated vote. There's just so much more when we think about redistributive justice. In terms of neoliberalism, that's a great question. And when you think about neoliberalism, is an offshoot of when we think about the classical liberal state and this idea of individualism, equal moral standing, and sort of this idea of freedom, right? And when you think about neoliberalism, it's the commodification, the privatization, the scapegoating of different folks, but basically the redistribution of things globally that are owned by the public and produced through public labor to the hands of private corporations and private individuals. That's what neoliberalism does. And when you think about how does neoliberalism commodify things, well, neoliberalism is the functioning paradigm of late capitalism, right? So it's a framework that capitalism operates in. And when we think about capitalism in the United States and globally, Cedric Robinson calls it racial capitalism. All that means is racist capitalism. That's what it means. So sometimes scholars, I push back against even using the word racial. I understand why he uses it in his classic Black Marxism, but to explain it to people, it's racist capitalism. It means that the organizing principle of capitalism, it's never been fair. There is no merit system. It's about the super exploitation of Black and Indigenous bodies to extract value and wealth from them while they're living, while you're raping them, while you're punishing them, while you're incarcerating them for their funerals, their children. That's why you arrest 5-year-olds coming out of school, right? It's for the super exploitation of Black bodies. And that's why after Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas, white folks were shooting down Black folks that day in Galveston, Texas, who were trying to claim their freedom and their citizenship and dignity. That's what neoliberalism does. But what neoliberalism also does is commodify resistance to it. That's what it does. Because in a capitalist society, in a racist capitalist society, you set up and manufacture scarcity through manufacturing homelessness, manufacturing housing insecurity, manufacturing Black kids disproportionately suffering from asbestos poisoning, lead poisoning, from asthma, Black women having worse maternal outcomes, even those making $200,000 a year or more, because our lives don't matter. That's why it's so important to say that Black life absolutely does matter. And the reason why you get such pushback when you say Black lives matter is because we're in a morally reprehensible and politically indefensible white supremacist, racist, capitalist society. That's why people get so upset. And the reason why we see such a vicious backlash during this third Reconstruction, during the context of the pandemic and Trumpism, is because the continuous super exploitation of Black people is what the society is based on globally. But even when people think through some kind of reform that they've gotten access, including Black athletes who are finally taking the knee after skipping a generation, because it skipped the Jordan generation. You've got LeBron and the folks globally taking a knee. They're being super exploited too. The reason why our college athletes and even our global athletes get access is because they're making people billions of dollars globally, and they're getting pennies on the dollar. That's what's happening to them, right? Remember, athletes aren't paid. Their money isn't paid through private equity. Private equity firms, right before Trump left office, they got in new laws that inure them from paying any taxes. Any taxes. New York Times just did a front page story on this. They're making trillions of dollars, no taxes, okay? So when we think about this idea of neoliberalism, it commodifies Black people, but now it's also commodifying resistance to white supremacy through foundation grants, not just the $100 million from Amazon, but all of us who are in university are connected to neoliberalism. These are corporations, and they make the university professorship and tenured positions scarce. They've manufactured that by having an academic a labor market. You talk about the Bronx slave market that Ella Baker wrote about. There's an academic slave, low wage market of adjuncts, of people with no health care who are teaching 8, 9, 10 jobs, right? All across places like California, Texas, New York. They have PhDs. They're in huge loan debt. Another thing of redistributive justice is cancel the student debt, period. Cancel the student debt, period, including students who've been bamboozled, more likely Black and Latinx and Indigenous, by for-profit scams. For-profit schools target us. Schools with no accreditation target us. So when we think about neoliberalism, it's looking to make money from us no matter what we do, no matter how long we live, how short our lives are, whether we are sick, whether we are mentally ill, whether we have Alzheimer's, whether we are millionaires. It's looking to super exploit us, period, right? And even those of us who are trying to resist, we're caught up until you create some post-capitalist society. You're caught up in it too. You're trying to get healthcare and pay the mortgage. Unless you can make all your clothes and grow all your food, you're caught up in it, right? So when we think about this idea of redistributive justice and neoliberalism, they go hand in hand, but we have to admit the structures and the constraints that we're all under, whether it's the Obama administration, the Biden administration, everybody right here is going to try to get paid until we redistribute the justice and the resources where the floor for everyone is a good living. Women get a year off with guaranteed pay after having children, right? Right? Where our young people who are disproportionately Black and brown, who have all kinds of problems because of the environmental, racist, and toxic conditions they live in, disproportionately, whether California and Hawaii to New York City, where I grew up, we disproportionately live in toxic physical environments because of segregation and generations of segregation, because of exclusionary zoning policies, because of housing and mortgage policies that are designed to bankrupt us and actually make money while doing it, which is why Black people lost the most wealth disproportionately during the mortgage recession and have been the people who've gained it back the slowest, right? We're the ones who get the least small business loans from the federal government, right? So when we think about neoliberalism, the same neoliberalism that criminalizes Black bodies makes money off of the criminalization of Black bodies. Right. So that's what we have to. So, and I'll close by saying this, in terms of redistributive justice, you can do redistributive justice at the federal, at the state and the local level and the global level. The first thing it requires is a wealth tax, not just a progressive income tax, but a wealth tax in perpetuity, right? The other thing it's going to require is reparations. And that's going to be trillions of dollars, everyone. And when we think about guaranteed healthcare, where do you get all this stuff from? You get all of it from wealth tax, and you also get it from redistributive justice. You don't focus on the politics of punishment, the politics of war, the politics of terror. You focus on a politics of community building and building that beloved community so we have an equitable floor for every single American, not just American, but every single citizen on the planet, because people who are not American citizens are global citizens and have global human rights. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Peniel. That was an excellent summation, I think, of all of the issues in the sense that all of this is interconnected. And I think as a closing thought for this panel, while justice must be redistributive and reparations are a part of justice, our survival is based on what Skye said. And that has to be, sorry, Skye, if you could repeat what you said about that, because with all of the words, it's lost me and I totally had it written down. Now I can't find it. But please, Skye, if you could talk about that last principle, I think I'd love to close us there.
Honestly, can't remember exactly what I said.
Does anyone remember the word? It was restorative. That's
okay.
it.
Restoration. Yeah. Okay.
Restoration.
Yeah.
So justice is redistributive. Justice requires reparation, but our survival requires restoration. And I think that's on a personal level, but also an environmental level. So thank you so much to our panelists for this riveting discussion. I've learned so much myself today. I'm sure I speak for many of us when I say that. And I will pass it back to Colby to close us out.
Erica, panelists, thank you so much on behalf of our board, on behalf of our community for joining us tonight. Thank you for sharing yourselves, for sharing such deep knowledge. I know that I personally have pages and pages and pages of notes. I want to make sure that we take all the links that Dylan and perhaps other panelists want to share. We're gonna keep those. We're gonna include them in a follow-up email to everybody that attended tonight to make sure that everybody gets those. So thank you for the knowledge. Thank you for the powerful conversation. I also want to thank our superstar staff, Shama, and especially Hannah, who've worked so hard to pull together all of these panels and pull together all of these panelists. A lot of coordination. And I know that our SNI and our board members are so appreciative for all the work you put in these last few weeks. If you'll permit me a few plugs before you log off, for all of those who may not know that much about CAPAL or want to know more, visit our website at CAPAL.org to learn more about us. Check out upcoming programming. You can follow us on all the social media channels. Tag us at CAPAL DC. I want to also put a plug that we are looking for more volunteers and new board members coming up this next month. So look out for announcements if you want to give back to the community, if you want to be involved in putting together these types of discussions and working with these incredible people. Join our board, think about it. Again, thank you to all of our sponsors who continued to support our programs and helping us continue to provide opportunities like this for the AANHPI community. CAPAL was initially an all-volunteer organization. We've served more than 600 scholars and interns, awarded more than $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergraduate and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, as well as prominent policy and advocacy organizations. We ask that you spread the word about our scholarship and internship program, especially our currently serving SNIs. Talk to members of your community. You are better ambassadors than we can be to reach out and to get new people to join this movement. Opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students open every year in November, and we know we'll be keeping in touch with you. Please consider if there are any students or organizations who might be interested in us, tell your University Career Center. Let's just spread the word. And if your organization is interested in partnering with us, you can reach out to any of us, but we will always point you to our managing director, Shama Ahmad, for sponsorship opportunities. Finally, we're always trying to improve our programming. I know that Josh has been putting the survey in the chat a few times, so I'm going to double down and say, please take the survey. We want to hear what you thought about tonight. We want to hear what you thought about our programming, because that helps us continue to iterate and improve. We thank you. We thank, again, panelists. Stick around for a little bit. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in for CAPAL's Washington Leadership Program. That's all, folks. Good night.